Mike, I heard from the guys you were kind of hanging out, listening to a little bit of what we talked about when it comes to these trade wars. You're a smart guy, deep thoughts. I'm just curious before we move on to any other topics. Any thoughts you have on what I had to say about this tariff war, trade war, potentially kinetic war?
I think you were spot on, actually, with your analysis about what was happening before was not working. We were slowly losing on a number of economic fronts to China. The only way to get back on the horse for how we dominated the 20th century is effectively to incentivize reindustrialization rather than deindustrialization. We used to have a bustling heartland that was gutted out with globalization. We now have our labor in our factories abroad, and we've already seen hundreds of billions of dollars of investments from foreign countries who just want to make their goods here now to avoid the tariffs. And if that can be done on the China side, first of all, that stuff immediately shifts leverage to the U.S. over China. And it's a painful process, but it's like any surgery. This is, as I see it, part of a strategy of leverage that goes in tandem with other things like internet censorship, where you are able to actually use these tariffs and the negotiation of them to incentivize favorable regulatory environments for businesses. Like threatening tariffs on the EU may be the way to stop something like the EU Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, which is levying billions of dollars of fines on U.S. tech companies.
And the people that think that everyone in this administration is stupid and that this is all ad hoc will say things like, we're never going to bring back T-shirt making in the United States. Even Dave Chappelle, who I think is actually very smart comedian, but I saw him do a bit where he's like, man, we don't want to make Nikes. We want to wear Nikes. And I think that even listening to Besant with Tucker, there's not a suggestion we're going to bring back. The Chinese, by the way, Mike, even put out this video. Did you see this video where they had like obese Americans, sewing stuff? It was an AI generated thing where they were kind of making fun of like fat middle class or lower class middle America, sitting at sewing stations and making iPhones. But if you listen to these guys, there is an acknowledgement. Well, you know what? AI and robotics is going to hurt a lot of these jobs anyway, but we can onshore the industrialization and do that here. It does leave open what still does happen to middle America. Like, where do they work?
Well, the picture is not necessarily pretty of Americans working in coal mines or, Americans, stumped over hot factory, and smelting irons during the 20th century and whatnot. I mean, the average life of a factory worker is not necessarily glorious. You can make a AI video poking fun at the hard life of Americans in the 20th century, but the fact is that is what gave us the manufacturing miracle. That is what allowed those individuals to buy homes, to put their kids through college, to have savings and disposable income. So it's not glorious, but it's how the greater glory of a powerful nation is built.
You brought up the EU's regulatory schemes and their antagonism towards free speech. Pretty fascinating to see Keir Starmer, by the way, lecture J.D. Vance on their embrace of free speech and the First Amendment. But, what's going on in Europe, I think, leads you and I to a deeper conversation, which you've been talking about. All the lawfare, all the stuff against Donald Trump, it didn't exist in a silo. It's happening now across Europe. It's happening in Romania. It happened in France with Marine Le Pen. Lawfare and doing away with candidates who are nationalistic, perhaps on the right, concerned about concerned about the well-being of their people over the EU.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in your point that it doesn't exist in a silo is such an important one for the audience to take away. There is a professional class of color revolution specialists. And by that term, that was a term that was always used lovingly and glowingly by folks in the foreign policy establishment, because it connotes, obviously, these sort of index card revolutions where we would effectively label groups that we wanted to support to topple a government by a particular color, and then we would, the Orange Revolution, the Green Revolution, the Velvet Revolution. Uh, but what that refers to is a special technique for toppling a democratically elected government. We say that we do it to stop autocracy in the name of democracy. There's this dichotomy that's used in the foreign policy establishment. And there's a professional class of folks whose job is to orchestrate these. And those folks exist in the State Department, they exist in the CIA and in the intelligence world, they exist in the NGO space. You see all this US aid money that goes to projects that say that they're for DEI, or they say that they're for LGBT programs, or they're for civil society capacity building, or to unions. What they're doing in country after country is they're building a capacity, getting people on payroll, training them to organize. We had a president in the United States who was a community organizer, Barack Obama, and we had a near president in Hillary Clinton who wrote her senior thesis on community organizing. This is a path to power, particularly for folks in the foreign policy establishment, because when you can topple a government and install a puppet in that place, you can shift the entire economics of the country to favor your sponsors. Or you can also shift the military posture of the country to allow a U.S. military base, or to get a favorable regulatory environments for multinational companies. So this was something the Republican Party endorsed fully during the Cold War when it was used to topple left-wing communism. The issue is we are in an undeclared Cold War right now against right-wing populism, against right-wing nationalism. Just as you identified, these countries really just want to make their own country great again and are deemed to be Trump-aligned. They're called populist because they represent the popular will of the people over the institutions. The foreign policy establishment gives that a dirty name because those institutions are the control mechanism for the State Department, for the intelligence services, for the multinational corporations who are the stakeholders in those government activities. And so this really set off with Trump winning the 2016 election, and we've been living for an entire decade in this. And this lawfare is part of a strategy that I don't think Republicans would have necessarily looked at twice if this was during the Cold War, in the heat of it, when we were toppling governments run by left-wing communists. The issue is we elected Donald Trump, a right-wing nationalist, right-wing populist. And so to have our own government effectively declare that anyone who's like our own government we need a Cold War against them, they've effectively declared war on the president.
Let's do a little bit of history, Mike, just for the audience's edification on color revolutions. The easiest one everybody can point to is Ukraine, right? The Orange Revolution. But give me another example, would you? What you said is undoubtedly true. I mean, it's factually supported that, the CIA, the State Department, and NGOs have fomented color revolutions across, well, not just Europe, but across the globe. But give me another great historical illustration of a color revolution.
Oh, there's dozens of them. I mean, you could argue that was the same thing that was done in Poland and in Hungary. Poland, for example, we backed the Lech Walesa movement, the Solidarity movement, which was unions that the workers and trade association folks. To this day, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA spinoff, has something called the Solidarity Center to work with unions around the world and give them money. We were funneling tens of millions of dollars to them, and they took to the streets, surrounded the Parliament building, and effectively, ousted the government through these angry street mobs. You saw the same thing happen in Serbia with the Otpor movement. The Otpor movement was essentially, young people, unions, aggrieved people from everywhere from the universities to the civil society organizations. That was in 1999 and 2000. The State Department and USAID gave $72 million to that group. They got military assistance from Pentagon advisors, and they ended up running Slobodan Milosevic out of the country by getting 200,000 people to surround the Parliament building, effectively January 6th, the elected government out of office. And you saw the same thing in 2014 with the Maidan coup. This was something that
Hmm.
our State Department bragged about, that actually Senator Chris Murphy bragged about, that only happened because of the U.S. giving millions of dollars of support in tandem with sanctions and threats of international tribunals. And once again, they surrounded the Parliament building. They shut down the streets and roads so that so that the entire economic infrastructure of the country was destabilized. And this is really the technique. When a country's government is popular and beloved by its people, but it wants to be overthrown by the State Department, the intelligence services, and their surrounding financial sponsors, what they do is they go through a process called destabilization, which means that you economically destabilize it, you destabilize it through provoking police crackdowns by having large mobs confront police. Then, when the police try to handle the problem, there's usually injuries or sometimes fatalities, and those are spun off as a sort of human rights crackdown. So you get international pressure and sanctions. And then you go to work on the courts. And this is what we're seeing right now here in the U.S. These large street protests that were done last week. I believe they're gearing up for much more substantial destabilizing protests in tandem with lawfare. USAID has something called judicial reform in its charter, which means that it's allowed to go out and work directly with the courts and prosecutors in foreign countries. The State Department has rule of law programs that support this financially, and we give hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars to NGOs to interact with the courts and to effectively get them to pass rulings that are favorable to this blob's interests. We saw this happen in Brazil with the Brazilian censorship court that banned X for a time and seized assets from
Hmm.
Starlink. It turned out USAID had a formal program working with that exact court. We see them working with the courts in Romania. And I would not be surprised if they were similarly back channeling through the U.S. Embassy in Paris with the arrest of Marine Le Pen.
Well, everything you just described as well, like you said, whatever happened, the protest last week here at home. I mean, you could diagnose a lot of these same symptoms and things going on right here in America.
Well, it's explicit. The Almost every senior leader involved in these Tesla takedowns at the thought leadership level, at the senior director level, is affiliated with this class of professional color revolution specialists. And I'll give you a couple examples. So Carlos Alvarez, for example, was on tape saying that you know that we need to have in order to get a job in order to get my next job, I need to be able to say that I bankrupted Tesla. So, and he's saying this to the crowd as he's bragging that these Tesla protests were his idea in the first place to target Tesla, and he's saying to an amped up crowd, I need you to shut down Tesla so that I can get my next job by putting on my resume that I bankrupted Tesla or I helped bankrupt Tesla. Now, think about how strange that statement is. Now, this is a guy who was just recently working. He co-founded the American Sunlight Project with Nina Jankowicz. That is a censorship NGO that was set up by both him and Nina Jankowicz, who was the Disinformation Governance Board czar. If folks
Right.
remember that strange affair from 2022 when DHS tried to set up a formal censorship board inside of the Department of Homeland Security. Nina Jankowicz then, when she was terminated from that Disinformation Governance Board, ran over to the UK. She became a registered agent for the British Crown under something called the Center for Information Resilience, doing USAID-funded censorship work in London. And then she went over to start this thing called the American Sunlight Project, which is also working with these EU censorship bodies, and is Nina Jankowicz comes from that exact world. She was in the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, which is the DNC branch of the CIA spinoff, the National Endowment for Democracy. She also worked for the Wilson Center, which is another one of these State Department USAID funded color revolution specialist groups. They are the ones who also host the CIA archives online. She was directly advising Ukraine. Her name is on the list for the Integrity Initiative, which was a NATO-backed British clandestine cloak and dagger operation that went down in flames in 2019 when it was revealed that it was secretly being backed by British intelligence. Carlos Alvarez co-founded that with Nina Jankowicz, and said this whole thing is basically his brainchild. And who is he auditioning for his next job? I ask Will. When I say that this is a profession, a vocation, you are hired to do this by the NGOs. You are hired to do this by the fiscal sponsors of these 501c3s and by governments. You could very easily, if you're working at these NGOs, be working like Victoria Nuland in the political section of the State Department or the intelligence services, on 2 weeks' notice. It's basically the same job, and you just switch from one side of the ball, whether that's the government side, the civil society side, the media side, or the private sector side. And they have a model called the whole society model, which ties those four categories of institutions together to orchestrate this activity. So when you're in the center of it, it looks like you're surrounded on all sides. And in the press, it's always portrayed as spontaneous, but that is sort of the magic of this, is that you try to artificially create the patina of an organic movement in order to say that you're doing it for democracy rather than in a straight up coup.
Man, well, every time I listen to you, Mike, it's always filled with details like that, and then you get in there and you feel like you're in a tornado, and kind of like as you described it, intentionally feeling. Like, how do you kind of peer through all of the winds and all the debris of the tornado to see there's actually an organized structure to this thing and not just chaotic winds, It makes you wonder, like, okay, well, then where is the headwind? Like, who is the fiscal sponsor? Who is the organizing effort? Like, okay, I get it. Full of NGOs, full of these figures who are professional, color revolution specialists, full of State Department and so forth. But like, at some point with that kind of coordination, you assume there's also organization, somebody that leads a lot of this vision.
Well, there's technical organization and there's sort of a financial hierarchies involved in these. So, for example, we were just talking about Carlos Alvarez, but another one of these color revolution professionals who are involved in the senior leadership in this is Norm Eisen. Norm Eisen is the legal hatchet man who was responsible for basically every significant act of lawfare against Donald Trump during his first term, during the 4 years out of power, and still today. He was the former U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic, who Chief Justice John Roberts flew to the Czech Republic twice to have planning sessions with Norm Eisen, and who then he was also the White House ethics czar for Barack Obama, and then he spearheaded the impeachments and all the various lawfare actions against Trump. He also spoke at the Tesla takedowns and has been working, coordinating essentially the legal side of that component. And you see this side by side. For example, the AFL-CIO spearheads the union side of this. You see but I guess your question more specifically on who's sponsoring this financially, it's a stakeholder coalition. So obviously names like George Soros come up a lot, but the fact is this is something that's co-invested in by coalitions of oligarchs who come together, just like basically in any coup. When there is dissatisfaction with a government in power, this would happen all the time in the 20th century, for example, where a country is nationalizing its industries with a left-wing socialist in power, for example, and so they're harming U.S. multinational companies. Well, technically, you're going to have organization at the State Department and at the War Department in the early 20th century, the Defense Department now, but you're going to have all of these commercial stakeholders who contribute. I call them the donor drafter class, because they donate into the pot of these organizations and then they draft off
Hmm.
of the actions that are taken once the new government is installed. So, for example, the copper companies would contribute if we were trying to overthrow the government of Honduras. You'd have oligarchs from the copper sector, from the agriculture, the banana companies. You'd have Coke and Pepsi if their bottling
Right.
operations were threatened. And you see something very similar here, where you have folks from the Chamber of Commerce who contribute. You have obviously the George Soros network. You have the Pierre Omidyar network. You have the Craig Newmark network. You have the Ford Foundation. You have the Carnegie Foundation. You have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Every single one of these are involved in sectors and industries that are impacted by Trump's policies. This is why there was a secret agreement signed between the AFL-CIO and the Chamber of Commerce about destabilizing protests to stop Trump's inauguration had he won the 2020 election. This was revealed in the Molly Ball, the famous Time magazine article shortly after the 2020 election cycle concluded. But the fact is that's what's happening here. You're going to hear that the tip of the spear is this group Indivisible, which is, basically, young kids who are being hung out as, the face of this on MSNBC. That is total hogwash. That is exactly what we did with Otpor, for example. Otpor was this group I mentioned in Yugoslavia that was funded to the tune of $70 million by the U.S. State Department to organize mass protests, to bus people in from around the country, trained to organize, given special manuals of Gene Sharp's From Dictatorship to Democracy, which is uh, the the comprehensive how to overthrow a government color revolution guide. You see the Indivisible kids who are holding up that same guide, which USAID pays to get printed in 70 different foreign languages. But the fact is what you have is a consortium of the same financial interests who are threatened by Trump's foreign policy, who are threatened by Trump's tariffs, who are threatened by his attempt to establish peace with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, and they were essentially relitigating that same battle from 2016 when Trump first ran.
I saw this article this morning, Mike, on that note. Let's see, this is out of, well, Zero Hedge posted it, but I think it's a column that was run in a British newspaper, The Telegraph. Tim Stanley is the columnist. He suggests big business could put a hit out on Trump. This in response to the tariffs and the trade wars we're talking about. That at some point, these moneyed interests will say, okay, we're getting crushed. Whether or not this is metaphorical or literal in what he's writing here, they're going to have to go after Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, now a lot of this is moving parts in the sense that countries are still approaching Trump. He actually bragged on tape just yesterday, I believe, that countries are coming to him begging like a dog, effectively, to try to strike deals, and that these tariffs are sort of they'll be a baseline, but the severity of them will move in time. But the fact is big business puts the hit out effectively in all of these cases. It's hard to look for a single one. I know that it's tempting to think, okay, who
There's
is the
one big
number
villain,
one? But the fact,
yeah.
and there are dominant folks who are, at the top of the hierarchy. But if you were to say, before Elon Musk came on the scene, for example, in 2022, and it became easy to put the world's richest man as a face behind Donald Trump. Donald Trump was sponsored, like every politician is, by donors. And it's hard to put on the Trump movement, one particular sponsor, who is responsible for the policies that he
Right.
may set when he promises them, "Oh, I'm going to do this." It's hard to say the same thing about Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton had the Clinton Global Initiative, which was a giant pot of money, which effectively took bribes in exchange for policy. She was the Secretary of State, effectively in charge of the foreign policy of the entire American empire and running for president, while she effectively held out a shingle for sale. Now, the single largest individual contributor to the Clinton Global Initiative was Viktor Pinchuk, the Ukrainian oligarch, who is all over this Ukraine-Russia war and sort of proxy war domestically here on Donald Trump over it. But I wouldn't say that Hillary Clinton is singularly controlled by it, even if she was beholden to the Clinton Global Initiative for taking their money in exchange for favors. You have a consortium. And when donors want to stop Trump, they are educated on the status of the organizations and the network web that's already in place, and they believe the best bang for their money is to capacity build those institutions until they get a critical mass. And that's why you see hundreds of stakeholders involved in this. And you have to sort of confront it at the organizational layer rather than looking at just, it's trench warfare.
Right.
You have to take it company by company. For example, if you're talking about companies putting out a hit on Donald Trump, I mentioned this before when Victoria Nuland gave the speech in the heat of the Maidan protests in 2014 to topple the democratically elected government of Ukraine, and she bragged about the $5 billion that USAID had given to these very groups, and how she was optimistic about the people effectively overthrowing that government. She did so at a sponsored event in front of signs for ExxonMobil and Chevron, who had billions of dollars in financial interests in toppling that government because Chevron had signed a $10 billion deal with Naftagaz, the state-owned company that the State Department was trying to privatize. So you see this all the time.
Right.
The fact is Trump is trying to woo these companies, and this tariff war is going to complicate that. But I think it's a necessary path to pursue.
I want to discuss two other stories with you really quickly, one of which jumps off of this idea of a hit on Donald Trump, and that's the story of Ryan Routh. He's the second would-be assassin of Donald Trump. Story came out that he was in the market for an RPG. That's what he was trying to buy to take out Donald Trump. I saw you recently with Matt Gaetz say this is what the headline read. Mike Benz says 95% probability Routh in some way worked for the United States government.
Yeah, well, the headline was a little bit taken out of context. The question was about whether or not Routh was working for someone who was working for someone who was working for someone for the U.S. government. I do think that Routh does appear to be a crazy person. I'm not saying that this was a sanctioned hit, so to speak, but the fact is people have an impression, I think, of the grunt work in the intel world, of it being sort of, James Bond folks, where people are, they're action figures, they're larger than life, they like their martinis shaken, not stirred. No, the fact is a lot of people who are involved in the day-to-day grunt work of, for example, intelligence work that recruits terrorists to fight in a proxy war. This is what Ryan Routh was doing. He was working with terrorist groups, violent paramilitary groups, and extremists in Pakistan, Syria, Afghanistan, and Iran. He was going to Telegram, going to Signal, going to WhatsApp, going to social media, and spending his entire day recruiting thousands and thousands. He bragged at one point that he had a stack of 5,000 passports, the front and back of pictures of passports of 5,000 terrorists and violent paramilitary folks from hot war conflict zones. Afghanistan, Syria. This is the CIA's largest operation in declassified history. Timber Sycamore was in Syria working with those same terrorist groups. Before that, we had our largest CIA DoD operation in Afghanistan with these very groups. The CIA built the Mujahideen, the predecessor to ISIS and Al Qaeda, and as the State Department, Jake Sullivan and Hillary Clinton agreed that ISIS was on our side in Syria. This is the famous WikiLeaks reveal email. And
right.
you can't just waltz into into a hot war and create a violent street paramilitary to wage that war. you need to be authorized by the Pentagon, by the intelligence services. The State Department has to be apprised of it. Ryan Routh was back channeling with the U.S. Embassy in Kiev to get these folks no-look, fast-pass visas so they could quickly join the war. When Ryan Routh was apprehended, he gave a business card that he was the director of a group called the International Volunteer Center of Ukraine, which is a project of a 501c3 called Mother of Ukraine, operating in Ukraine, which again is a sort of U.S. government funded group in Ukraine that Routh was recruiting these people to go and join for the war effort. So the fact is this work is done through a Byzantine labyrinth of subcontractors, so that there's never an international scandal that the Pentagon or the CIA was directly telling ISIS to come and kill Russians, as ISIS claimed credit for killing Russians in the Moscow attack earlier last year, as they've been killing Russians in the Sahel in Africa, as they were killing Russians in Syria. You need a layer of plausible deniability, so these things are subcontracted out to private corporations, who then subcontract that work out to individuals that they know, who then subcontract that work out to their friends and family. And this is how you have folks like Ryan Routh, who appear to be poor on the one hand, and yet they are taking whirlwind trips around the world, to Taiwan, to South Korea, to, as I mentioned, Afghanistan and Syria, to Romania. And you don't get to do this work unless it's greenlit by the intel world. And the fact is Ryan Routh was arrested something like 80 times in his life, never spent a day in jail. He was on the radar of DHS. He was flagged by the Department of Homeland Security, who believed that his story was highly suspicious when he handed them that business card in Ukraine and was working in these terrorist zone countries. The Customs and Border Patrol specifically asked Mayorkas's DHS to investigate Ryan Routh, and then wrote that they refused to do so, which I think was a very strange. They didn't say they declined to investigate Routh. They said DHS refused to, which to me signals that they knew what he was doing and that he was a part of a network. I suspect that there were 1,000 other people like Ryan Routh who were working throughout the day to try to do this. We saw a mass influx of these groups into Ukraine, just like Ryan Routh was recruiting them to do.
Your theory, Mike, and how you arrive at that probability, but the way that you also think it's been distorted is he's somewhere in this ecosystem where the wheels have been greased for him to have this international world travel and access to markets in hot war zones. Also, not just wheels greased, but sanctioned in some way to be doing this work. You don't get to just do it ad hoc and, freelance. And so he was somewhere in the ecosystem of this subcontractor dark world of intel operations in these countries. But that doesn't mean necessarily, but he still is a crazy person, and that doesn't mean that he is sanctioned to do this thing at home to take out Donald Trump. Is that sort of a synopsis of your thesis?
Yes, exactly. But what I'd add to that is, so it would not be a formally authorized activity. The way this would operate in practice would be some rogue cell within the intel world or within the Pentagon or within the USAID network gets intelligence reports that this person who's involved in this recruiting effort and is therefore sort of reporting up the chain about his contacts. And we saw Routh do this constantly. Ryan Routh was constantly back channeling with folks with the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. And then remember that Routh attempted to buy those rocket launchers to shoot down Trump's plane. Remember, this happened in tandem with him showing pictures of Trump's plane and saying Trump gets on and off this every day. And he was attempting to purchase essentially surface-to-air projectiles, which also coincides with another strange report that we saw 10 days after the Ryan Routh incident, where Trump was briefed on a similar plot from Iran, which maybe is a side story in this. But the point I'm getting at is, if you know somebody is going to do within that network is going to do something criminal, and you see that this person is talking to contacts within the network, is doing these written communications with people in the network, and you know it's going to happen, do you let it happen instead of sicking the Justice Department on the person because it would be favorable to your interests if they did? And if you had a cell at CIA or a cell at DOD or a cell at state or USAID, for example, the U.S. Embassy was working with this guy, was working with this guy's network constantly. You had the International Volunteer Center of Ukraine, you had Mother of Ukraine, you had him trying to get the U.S. Embassy to get visas for thousands, literally thousands of terrorist and violent extremist folks. If they had advanced knowledge that he was talking crazy about this, that he was working on the logistics to try to assassinate Trump, you could see a situation very, very easily where they say, listen, typically, we'd alert the Justice Department about this, but we're going to let this one slide because it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if this happened. It seemed like everyone in the network, I should note, had a similar philosophy. The Mother of Ukraine, 501c3 fiscal sponsor that Routh was involved with in Ukraine, the founder of that 501c3 had a Facebook post saying that he wished that Trump were dead and having memes of Trump in a coffin. So it seemed like the whole network wanted Trump dead, and that Routh was sort of the person crazy enough to try to go to Mar-a-Lago to do it. Leads me to believe that on top of it being greenlit what he was doing, so he's clearly in the network and sanctioned, clearly protected by the Justice Department in some fashion before that, given that he had never spent a day in jail despite essentially a career of crime, that he was aggressively ignored by DHS when he was flagged for investigation just a year before, a year before the shooting, but while he was actively recruiting these terrorists. The fact is we already know from the Justice Department filings that he was talking with people about this idea for months ahead of time. I think they simply looked the other way, and the question is what does that network, that topography of that network map look like? And that's something really only the Justice Department can tell us. The issue is the Justice Department has already postponed Routh's trial. Remember, this was 8 months ago, an attempted assassination on the U.S. government. You may be asking, why the heck is this taking so long? Why do we find out he's attempting to buy RPGs to shoot down Trump's plane 8 months after the fact? You would think this would be the number one investigation.
And
in
under
the
an
US
attorney
government.
general appointed by Donald Trump. So why?
Well, what they say is Ryan Routh left such an extensive trail of an electronic footprint that it's taking them months and months to investigate. This is why they said that they asked to postpone the trial, was because of the sheer volume of evidence to investigate is mind-boggling. They said it was something like hundreds of terabytes of an electronic footprint that Ryan Routh left between all of his communications, all of his phones, his home devices. Now think about that. We were told that Ryan Routh was essentially a homeless person, that his homes and assets were in foreclosure, that he only owned effectively a beat-up car to his name with Kamala Harris bumper stickers on it, and yet he left hundreds of terabytes of an electronic footprint. I try to think of a homeless person. I'm a serial online chronicler. I download, pretty much everything I come across. Hundreds of terabytes is something in my entire lifetime of online activity as a professional in this space I've not generated. So the question is how do you generate that much of an online footprint unless you're in the, you're in this space professionally and sanctioned and working with a network, working with such heavy data.
Okay, one last story because we've teased it as well. Story comes out. In some ways, it's unsurprising, but there was the Wuhan Games in October of 2019 that brought in military from across the world, including United States military. 7 U.S. soldiers come down with COVID-like symptoms. I don't think they were ever officially diagnosed. There may not even been a test at that time. Maybe there was in China. I don't know. But it's pretty well accepted that these guys had COVID in October of 2019. Those guys flew back to Washington, by the way. Washington was an early hotspot of COVID. This was scheduled to be released in 2022 by the Biden administration, and it was not released. Your thoughts, Mike?
Well, I think it's for, in this case, I think the worst case scenario is probably warranted. You can understand why the Biden administration stonewalled this report, and even though they were required by Congress for 2 years to release it, they refused to, and now we come out and see why. It's because it totally undermines the sort of the origin story
Wet
of
market.
COVID-19 that we were not
Right.
just told and sold by our own health and intelligence and defense officials. It was the linchpin of the censorship operation to stop any rumors about what may have started this thing. But what I find so terrifying about this reveal is I went back and there was this, one of the strangest events in the whole COVID phenomenon was the unbelievable foresight down to very granular details that was carried out on October 18th, 2019 by Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins is a major Pentagon think tank, sort of biomilitary planning center. It's just like Harvard plays a similar role in the Northeast. You have Johns Hopkins, which is right there, in the thick of the DMV or the DC,
Yeah.
Virginia, Maryland area. And this was an event it was called Event 201, and it was a tabletop planning exercise that was jointly sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and Johns Hopkins University. And they had tabletop simulating the release of a bat-borne coronavirus from China that would cause flu and flu-like symptoms and would spread like a pandemic across the globe in December of 2019. So again, this was held on October 18th, 2019, and it explicitly simulated a breakout in December 2019. And it brought together, this was not just some random simulation. At the simulation planning it was Avril Haines, who was then the deputy director of the CIA, and who became, under Joe Biden, the head of the ODNI, the director of national intelligence, the head of the entire intelligence community. It brought in her comparable from Chinese intelligence, from China. It brought together members of the media. It brought together members from Pfizer and the pharmaceutical world community. It brought together government regulators, and it planned down to the detail exactly how this thing would play out and what to do to contain conspiracy theories about the origin of the spread. I put on my X account yesterday a replay of this. The segment 4 in their module had all of these stakeholders from government, from the private sector companies, from the civil society organizations, and from the media, deliberately planning how to censor the internet, to shut down conspiracy theories about this being a man-made virus. Now, what's so crazy about what just got revealed about this Biden national security document about the Wuhan military games is that the origin start date for the Wuhan military games was October 18th, 2019. The tabletop exercise planning a bat-borne coronavirus from China that would widely be believed and needed to be stopped being believed as being a man-made virus was done the exact same day, down to the exact day as the Wuhan military games, where we now know, or at least the evidence from the Biden administration suggests is highly likely, was the very day of the outbreak. They planned the simulation the same day of the outbreak. That is just an astounding detail. And again, the simulation posited that the outbreak would occur in December, mid-December. December 18th is what December 15th through 18th is what they had in the simulation. That's exactly when the outbreak formally occurred for the pneumonia-like symptoms in Wuhan. It was December 12th to December 14th when the initial one. So it's like they planned it all the way down to the date.
Mike, what would be that's fascinating. Those are fascinating facts. This morning, when I was talking about the potential for kinetic war on the heels of a trade war, because history suggests to us that's a potentiality, you could see what China would do when backed into a corner. This morning, we were having a conversation about a Chinese release of a man-made virus and you can easily see the motivations at the end of the Trump administration, also dealing with, similar trade issues, not to this extent, but similar trade issues. What do you do when you're backed into a corner? Could you suppress the entire world economy? Would that be in the Chinese interest? What would be the interest of all of these stakeholders you just described in some coordinated, planned release of COVID?
Well, there could be a number of interests. I mean, so first of all, what you want to do is you want to destabilize. This is, as I mentioned. Now, just to be clear, I'm not asserting facially that COVID was deliberately released. For example, you could have this. I suspect, for example, in the Event 201 situation that I just laid out, that there may have been early reports of the COVID breakout before October 18th, 2019, yeah. and that at that point it was known that it could not really be contained, and so they did the breakout. They did the simulation of the breakout, sort of knowing that this thing was a fait accompli, and hey, what do we do about it? Let's get 130 people from all these different governments and companies and media organizations and the intelligence community all together, and that folks who were at the Wuhan military games were simply not apprised of this beforehand, although it would be known to a smaller set of stakeholders. But the fact is the interest in releasing a virus. I'll give you a great example from just 3 weeks ago in the JFK files. The JFK files showed that the U.S. military, deliberately plotted to drop Lyme disease, effectively tick-borne bacteria and what they called biological agents thought to be of natural origin. That's the direct phrase from the national security document released in the JFK files. This has been redacted for 60 years. We just learned that they literally planned to have tick-borne viruses, which the military was using gain-of-function research to create in the Rocky Mountain Laboratory in Montana. They were collecting fleas and ticks. They were juicing them up with bacteria in order to drop them on Cuba, to destabilize Cuba's economy, and to destroy their agriculture, and therefore bring down the popular government in Cuba. That was the purpose. It was part of a regime change operation to drop, gain-of-function agents on the country to kill its economy and sabotage the popularity of the president. That was authorized by the National Security Council, by the U.S. Pentagon, the intelligence services. They even specifically mentioned in that document that it would run through the Pentagon and the CIA. They, as I mentioned, that was done in the Rocky Mountain Lab. That was a Tony Fauci lab. Tony Fauci, the Rocky Mountain Lab, was the same lab involved in COVID. This is where the DARPA furin cleavage site, gain-of-function, Pentagon-funded research was done for COVID. It's the same, it's not just the same playbook, the same players, literally the exact same labs. The other lab that was mentioned in that JFK file drop was Fort Meade in Maryland, which is the exact site of the anthrax outbreaks in 2001. The military biosecurity lab that the anthrax, the military grade of anthrax was used in the lab leak for the anthrax attacks that effectively got us to war in Iraq and Afghanistan after September 2001. So they're using the exact same labs in tandem with it. But if it was an intentional release, it would be for the same reason that was done with JFK in Cuba. Remember, at that time, Trump was hugely popular in 2019. Paul Krugman said that it would be a cold day in hell and pigs would freeze over or whatever if the GDP ever hit 3% and it hit 4% within Trump's first year. The stock market was at all-time highs. He was widely popular and beloved. It all came to a screeching halt with the release of COVID, which we now know had a fatality no higher than the flu, while the flu completely disappeared. So at the end of the day, a lot of this was hugely overblown. The fatality rates seem to appear to have largely come from remdesivir and putting people on these intubated tubes, which is why the U.S. had a higher fatality rate than the entire rest of the world. But the fact is we don't know whether they made it happen or allowed it to happen or a lab leak. But any one of the scenarios for those is completely damning to the entire military intelligence and biosecurity establishment.
So fascinating. My first time to get to speak to you. I've listened to you on several occasions, even every single one of these topics worthy of an hour on their own. But I'm glad we got the time together today, Mike. I hope we can do it again sometime, not in the too distant future. Mike Benz, thank you so much.